Welcome to the International School of Tailoring. My name is Reza and this is going to be your 15th lesson of our How to Make a Bespoke Jacket series. In the previous lesson, we learned all about darts and wedges. In today's lesson, we are going to build the canvas construction of the Pagoda model. Making canvases is a 5-step process. Step 1, soak the canvas and the horsehair. Step 2, cut the materials. Step 3, baste all the materials and the components together. Step 4 is going to be, of course, padding all the layers to make them one. And step 5 is going to be taking the darts out. Every one of these steps requires a lot of concentration and finesse. If you've never done this before, please take your time. You can always come back by using the chapters in the video right where you left off. Are you ready? Let's go. Let's begin with step number 1, which is the soaking of our body canvas and our horsehair. If you're following this lesson with our Improvers bundle, great stuff. You've got exactly what you need and the right amount of it. If, however, you don't have a bundle and you haven't bought one and you're wondering, what do I need? How much do I need? Check out lesson number 5, in which I explain exactly what you need and how much. Now, if you have already made a traditional model, you can skip this part because I will assume that you already know how to soak these canvases and also know why we do it. But if you haven't and this is the first model that you're making, stay with me. So, why do we soak our canvases? 2 reasons: starch and shrinkage. Let's begin with starch. When the manufacturer produces these canvases, they put some starch on top of these materials to make them firm and rigid. Sometimes that starch is too much. What will happen is when you put your iron on, glowing patch of starch appears because it burns. In the worst case scenario, that starch sticks to your iron plate and stays there forever. So, we want to remove some of that surface starch just to make sure that we don't get glowing red iron patches on our beautiful canvas. Reason number 2 is going to be shrinkage. When these materials are woven, they are put under a lot of pressure and tension. Sometimes they are wet during that process. Regardless of whether they are wet or not, they get woven and finished under a lot of tension. That tension remains in the fibers. As soon as you expose it to water, they shrink. They become smaller, and that's something that we want to avoid for our jacket. So, we're going to take some warm water, which encourages a lot more shrinkage than cold water, and put our canvases in that water. Make sure it's thoroughly wet. If you're taking it out after 15 minutes and you see dry patches, put it back in. Once it's wet, take it out and allow it to dry completely naturally. Never, never, never dry a wet canvas with your iron, because then you're going to have burnt starch on your iron. Now, something interesting. Starch does dissolve better in cold water, but the fibers won't shrink as much in cold water than in warm water. So because we don't want to remove all the starch and we just want to remove a bit of it, but we do want everything to shrink as much as possible, that's why we use warm water. Are you ready? Let's do this. Take your canvas and your horsehair and put it into warm water. Make sure that the water gets everywhere and leave it at least for half an hour. After half an hour, double check. You can open up the canvas to see if all the areas between the folds have become soaking wet. If not, leave it a little longer, and once it's completely wet, let it dry naturally, and then we'll begin. So, we have soaked our canvases and everything is dry. But before we continue cutting them out, you may have wondered, why did we not soak the domette? Isn't the domette going to shrink? Doesn't it make sense to shrink the domette beforehand as well? Yes, the domette is going to shrink to some extent, but no, it doesn't make sense to shrink the domette beforehand. Here is why. Domette is a very loosely woven material, so think of domette as this. You have some warps, and you have the weft, And these yarns are all very far away from one another. So the gap between them is fairly large. Now, when we pad our canvases, imagine that we go through these holes and do our padding and so on and so forth. And now between every bite or every stitch that we have this large gap around it, okay? Now, when materials shrink, everything contracts. When everything contracts, these yarns are pulled together and the gap around our stitches becomes a lot smaller because everything is pulled together. But because the starting point is already so large, it's just going to contract and make the gap around our stitches smaller, but not to the extent to start pulling on the stitches themselves. If domette was a very tightly woven material like Silesia, and we were expecting shrinkage, and we would pad our canvases, and by the time it would shrink, it would immediately start to pull on our stitches. But because it's a very loosely woven yarn and material, it doesn't do that. So that's why we have excluded that unnecessary process so that we can just get on with the work. So now that you know that, let's continue and cut out our body canvases. If you have made our traditional model with our foundation bundle and are now making our pagoda model with the improvers bundle, you will notice that we have a lot more canvas than we had in the foundation bundle. The reason for that is that we're going to have many more components in the construction of our canvas and therefore need more materials. Now, if you have the bundle, that's great because the canvas is very wide and it allows you to mark everything once and cut both layers at the same time. But if you're planning to do this with your own materials, it's going to be very unlikely for you to find a canvas that's wide enough to allow you to cut things on the double. In that scenario, I have two options for you, and I recommend the first one. The first one is going to be just get the bundle. You'll have everything you need in front of you, the same as I have in these lessons, and it feels like you're in the same room with me. You'll save a lot of shipping, you'll save a lot of time looking for all these materials, and you can go through this process as smooth as possible. But if you cannot afford the bundle or you can't do it for whatever reason, don't worry, we are after all here to help you to learn tailoring regardless of your resources. In the second option, I recommend just get double the amount of canvas so that you can fold it along the length and then cut things on the double. It's going to cost you a bit more, but it's going to save you a lot of hassle because we're going to have a lot of components and I don't want to confuse you with offsetting them and cutting one at a time and do all of that. So, having said that, let's smooth out our beautiful canvas. We'll start and press everything on a single layer to make sure that all the wrinkles are out and the grain is nice and straight. If we have to some extent, correct the grain, we'll do that and assess it once everything is a bit smoother. So, if you have a domestic iron, use the steam function. If you haven't, use your spray bottle. Once you're done ironing your canvas smooth, it's time to position it on the fold. Now, what is very important here is for you to look at the actual grain and try to match the grain of the top layer with that of the bottom layer. I know that it makes sense to just match the selvage, but that doesn't always make the grain match. So what I want you to do is to double check and see if the grain is matching, and if you have to move this layer a bit forwards, backwards, sideways, do that so that the entire grain is matching along the length of the weft. And that's that. Now, what exactly are we going to cut out of this piece of canvas? Some of the parts we're not going to cut out yet. We're going to do that once we get to finish the jacket, but I'll give you a brief overview. In this area, we're going to cut out the front panel, and then we're going to have the separate shoulder piece roughly in this area. Next to the front panel, we'll have the skirt piece, which is going to extend all the way to the inlay of the side vent. And then on this side, we're going to have an extra lapel piece, and the remaining corner that we have here is going to be used for our wing pads. That's going to be a curved shape like so. But first, let's begin with the necessary, and that is the front panel. Take your forepart. We're going to have to prepare a few lines first. The first line that we're going to make is going to be from where the front pitch on the armhole intersects with the front side to where the break line intersects with the gorge. So I want you to draw a straight line through these two intersections, like so. Once you've done that, just simply put a line as a notch right in the middle. The next thing that we're going to have to prepare is going to be the grain of our canvas in the shoulder piece. We have separated the forepart and the shoulder, and now we have to make sure that the shoulder has that bias angle. So take a protractor, align the 45-degree angle of that protractor with your shoulder line so that the protractor is now giving you a 45 degrees angle downwards towards the armhole. Okay? So this is going to be the grain. Move your forepart over, take your side body panel, and I want you to match the bottom and the hip line on the edge of your pattern to the bottom and the hip line on the edge of your forepart. So I will have to position it like so. That's the bottom and the underarm seam edge right here. And here we're going to have the hip line and the underarm seam edge like so. And now what I want you to do is to mark 2 inches, that's 5 centimeters, above your pocket mouth, like so, and draw a line all the way to the edge of your side body panel, like so, like so, like so. Then I want you to move this over, double check to see if the hip line is matching, and mark the hip line also on the edge of your side body panel. Once you've done that, remove the side body panel. We're going to use that later. And now let's continue with the forepart. Because we're going to have to put everything so that all the panels match, I want you to do exactly as I have. Have the selvage away from you and position your front panel so that the chest line is matching the grain of the canvas. Give a 1/2 inch distance between the very edge of your canvas and make sure that the layer underneath it has the same amount. So if they're overlapping, don't match the selvage. Remember, we have matched the grains and sometimes that offsets the selvage. So just flip it up. If you have to, make a pencil mark right here, and then 1/2 inch behind that is the amount of room that we need to have at least for our body canvas, like so. Okay, so double check, is the chest line matching? And bring everything down so that the edge of your inlay is aligned with the edge of your canvas. Now, this is what you're going to do. 1/2 inch around the gorge of the lapel and the lapel itself and the front edge. That's 1.2 centimeters, by the way. And that. Take a piece of chalk or a piece of graphite and mark a quick line and get some exercise as well. Like so. Now, what I want you to do is to mark this line that we have that separates the body and the shoulder right here and right on this point. Now, here I want you to step outwards 1 inch. That's 2.5 centimeters. So let's measure that. That's 1 inch. And I want you to now mark 1 inch all around the armhole from that point. So it's going to be like this, and like this, and like this. So you can curve that and like so. All right, we're not going to cut this out yet. So the next thing to mark is going to be the side shield. Move 1 inch over from the edge of your underarm seam and mark 1 inch right there. The next thing to mark is going to be the point between the center line of the dart and the underarm seam. So that's going to be right here. Simply mark a line like so, and at the same time mark the intake line right here. Now I want you to mark that 2 inch line that we marked above the pocket mouth. So if you want to do that accurately, put a weight so that nothing moves, put a pin through that line, lift up your fabric, make a dot, put a pin at the end of that line, lift up your fabric, make a dot, and you can connect that later. As for the sides, I want you to mark exactly the edge of your panel right here, and that is more or less the outlines. Now, let's mark the rest. What I want you to do is to flip over your fabric. This is going to be the point between the center line of the dart and the underarm seam. What I want you to do is to extend the intake line up to that point, like so. You can just follow the straight grain, and then add a step that is the same size as the intake of our dart outwards. So that's going to be 3/4 or 2 centimeters in this case, like so. Now what I want you to do is to extend the inlay of the armhole that we had right here and connect this line as a beautiful curve into this point that we marked away from the midpoint between the center line of the dart and the underarm seam line. We're going to have to mark our 2 inch above the pocket line, like so, and connect all these nice and smoothly together all the way upwards. You can use your chalk or you can use your graphite. This point, that was the point between the center line of the dart and the underarm seam, is simply going to go straight down and curve into this line right here. Flip your fabric over for one last marking, and that is going to be the hip line. I want you to mark the hip line right on the edge of your underarm seam here. So that's the outlines. Now it's time to mark the details inside the panel. We're going to start with the first button. Simply take a pin, put that through, lift up the fabric and make a mark. Like so. A plus sign is ideal. Now we can move on to the break line and do that on the break line as well. Have 2 points in the middle and 1 right at the top. Now also mark the notch that we have here between the line that separates the shoulder from the body, like so. Next, it's time to mark our dart, the top point of the dart and the intake point of the dart. We are going to put a dart through the front side, pointing towards the top point of our front dart right here. Okay, this is going to be our front side dart. We want to make sure that we know exactly where this dart lands and that it doesn't go into the outbreast area. So what we're going to do is we're going to mark the baseline of the outbreast as well. And of course, last but not least, around the armhole, right on the edge of our fabric. And that's it. Now, take off the fabric and mark solid lines for all these points. Start with your break line, which connects to your first button. Then mark your first button, following the grain. Next, we can do the front dart. Then we can do the base of the outbreast welt. And of course, the line that separates the shoulder from the body, which is going to be right here. Double check to see if you've got exactly the same markings as I have. If you don't, go back and double check what went wrong. So we have the first button, we have the break line, we have the line that separates the shoulder from the body along with a notch, the base of the outbreast welt, the 1 inch step from the point of the edge of our pattern at the armhole area, the inlay thereof, the side shield. Then we have the point that is between the underarm seam and the intake point of our dart. We have a step that is the same size as the total intake of our front dart, which is 3/4 or 2 centimeters in our case. Then we have a nice curve that connects that to the 1 inch over the underarm seam. We have the actual midpoint between the intake line and the underarm seam, which goes straight down into the 2 inch line above the pocket mouth. And we have the hip area, which of course was marked on the edge of our pattern, and the hip line. This is just a notch. We don't need an entire line. So if you've got that, congratulations, let's move on. Shift the canvas over like so. And now it's time to take our side body. Now, what I want you to do is to take the side body and to position it so that the hip line of the side body, which we have marked from our pattern, is perfectly aligned with the cross grain of our canvas, and the bottom of the inlay should match the bottom edge of the canvas. Now you can bring this closer so that the lines are against one another, and what you're going to do now is to mark the outlines of this edge, the notch for the hip line so that it can be sewn to this notch, this line here that was a continuation of our 2-inch line, and the edge of the shield for the side vent. Now, if you're confused and you think, yeah, but hold on, why is this higher than this point? Why are these two not aligned? The reason is because they are not seam on seam. If the seam goes on the seam, as you can see, then the notches will match and that line as well. So take the side body off, mark a solid line for the top of your hip canvas, mark a smooth line for the hip at the underarm seam, and a smooth line for the hip at the back. That's that. Double check. Does it look like what I have in front of me? If not, go back, rewatch. If so, perfect. Let's move on. Take your forepart, and what I want you to do is to match this grain that we marked on the shoulder with the visible weft grain of your canvas. Now, don't do it like that. You're going to waste a lot of canvas. Instead, flip your panel over like so that you have the front side next to the line that separated the body from the shoulder. Okay? Now, this is important. We don't need all of this area, so you can move it as low as you need to in this corner, as long as this edge right here is not over the edge of your canvas. So we're going to tell you exactly where it should be. So bring it low, bring it low, bring it low. So now I'm reaching the limit of how far I can go while keeping this on the grain. So I'll bring it a little bit higher, like that. Make sure that this is matching. If you have a distance of 1 centimeter, ½ inch between the edge of your canvas, then that's perfect. Just make sure that the layer underneath it is marked so that you don't have one layer shorter than the other. So now I have a distance of about ½ inch between the edge of my canvas and the grain is matching. So that's all very well. We now need to have that one step of 1 inch here as well. So I'm going to bring this a little bit higher to give me enough for that 1 inch step. All right? That looks about right. Now, this is what I want you to do. I want you to mark this line that separates the shoulder from the body on both ends and add that 1 inch step on the side. So that's 2.5 centimeters right here. Now I want you to add ½ inch in front of your neck point inlay and above your gorge. That's 1.2 centimeters and like that. This doesn't need to be hyper accurate to the ½ millimeter. As long as it's roughly ½ inch or a centimeter, then that's fine. Not less than that. Now also add ½ inch above the shoulder inlay. Again, that's 1.2 centimeters, as stupid as that sounds. And ½ inch on the side of your armhole. And connect that to the 1 inch step that you had on the side. Okay, now don't forget to mark this notch. This is going to be important when we machine these two together. So take a pin, insert it right on that point, and mark. Now you can take the fabric away and mark a solid line for the line that separated the shoulder from the body. It sounds all very violent, I have to say. And that's your shoulder piece done. Now, why we chose this specific grain for the shoulder piece, I have explained thoroughly in lesson number 13, which is called Canvas Construction Theory. Go back to that one and check it out if you're wondering why we are doing this. So this area is going to be used for our extra lapel piece, and this area is going to be used for our wing pad extension. So please, once we have cut everything out, do not use the remaining space until we are supposed to use it. As for now, let's mark stitch all these details so that we can transfer them over to all sides of our layers. All right, now let's shift this over. Make sure the grain is still matching because things do move when you shift your materials over. And that's it. Now, I recommend you use a very bright colored thread so that you can instantly see where your markings are. If you're using a white marking thread, it may be difficult to spot the points that you have mark stitched on a white canvas. Of course, if you're using a black canvas or a green canvas, then it's fine to use a white mark stitching thread. So I'm going to go ahead and use this on the single and start mark stitching the break line, the out breast welt base, the front dart, and that's it. So base of break line, right where it intersects with the first button. 2 points in the middle and 1 at the top. Next, base of front dart center line and the top of front dart center line. Mark 1 across the top as well to know exactly where the point is, and 1 at the bottom. Now it's time for the corners of the out breast welt base. And that's it. Now it's time to cut. Please, please, please be very careful. We have a lot of lines. So let's do this together, step by step. Take a weight and put it on your material so that nothing moves. Then start with the very outer line that you have on the front edge around the lapel all the way up. Then we have the lapel inlay, the gorge, and we're going to stop right at the line that separated the body from the shoulder. You can cut off this small excess and keep the bigger pieces just in case you make a mistake, but for now, put them away. I might as well start from here because it's easier access. I'll go right on this line that separates the shoulder and the body, go all the way to this line here and cut the rest of the lapel out. Step over and cut the rest of the lapel. It's best for us to start with the underarm seam of the front, go on the line that's 2 inches above the pocket mouth, curve into the step, make the step, cut the shield, go around the inlay of the armhole, go into that step, and then cut the line that separates the body from the shoulder. Careful, please. Now, there is a possibility that you can get confused here because we have another line inside that represents the edge of our pattern. This is just for our reference, but we're going to cut this outer line into the step and then the line that separated the body from the shoulder. All right, now we have completely cut out the front. Before you do anything else, make sure the edges are matching. Just make a small cut right on the notch that we made on this line that separates the body from the shoulder, and a notch right here around the hip. All right, so let's just put this aside for a moment, shift this up, match the edges of your canvas, put a weight on, and now let's cut the outer lines of our hip piece. Before you remove it, make the notch. Don't break your arm like I did. And we can put this right on our front panel. And then last but not least, cut out the shoulder piece. Weight on. Outer lines, so I have a line here which may confuse you. That's the line from the previous panel. I'm going to go to this very outer line all around. And of course, don't forget the notch. Let's remove the remainder of the canvas. This you can cut off. Put these aside, bring back our front panel, and now flip it over to mark the rest on all layers. But before we do that, don't forget to cut through very carefully. It's actually better to cut through from this side because you can see how much thread you've got left. So what you'll notice is I only have one mark stitch here. It would have been better if I had one across so that I know exactly where the button is, but I know that the last thread here, or the first one, depending on which angle you look at, is the base for the button. So I'll use that. Just be conscious of that. Let's flip this over, take our ruler and start marking. Break line, front dart, base of front dart and top of front dart, base of outbreast welt, corners, and of course, first button. Now, I'm going to do exactly the same on the insides. So, all I've done is to mark the lines on all sides. You can ignore this mark because I marked that wrong. And then, once I marked everything, I removed all the mark stitches. Now, before we mark and cut our horsehair, we have to join our shoulder piece. So, the shoulder piece that we have cut here has to be joined right to the body. We need a strip of lining to do that. So take out your lining, open it up, smooth it out, and along the bottom of your lining, on the cross grain, mark the length of your shoulder piece. So you can take your canvas basically, mark how much you need in terms of length, and then with a ruler, mark a straight line. If you want to know how straight that line is on the grain, just simply pull on both ends, and if it doesn't create a diagonal twist and it's just right tense on the same line, you have a straight line. So mark one line, and then about 2.5 centimeters, that's 1 inch, mark a strip and cut out on the double. So that's that. It doesn't matter whether it's on the right side or the wrong side. It's going to be covered by fabric anyway, so don't worry about that. Now, get everything back to where it was. Bring your canvas. To prevent yourself from getting confused, put an X on one side, leave the insides free and empty, and put an X on the other side as well. Mirror your canvases and mirror the shoulder pieces. So we have a notch here that's going to match to the notch there, like so. We have our shoulder piece matching the other canvas. Just let these overlap. Put the strip on top, put a pin right through it, and the same here. And let's take them to the sewing machine to close them up. What we're going to do is we're going to have both of our canvases in front of us as we have pinned them against the lining, just to make sure that we have two symmetrically mirrored parts. We don't want to end up with two left or right sides. Once you are sure that you have two symmetrically mirrored parts, roll one of them up and put it on your lap. Let's work on them one by one. Now, what I want you to do is to use a matching color thread. By that I mean the color of the thread should match the color of the fabric. If you're using the Improvers bundle, this thread will be included in it and you can use that. I, however, will be using a black thread so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. We need a bit of a contrasting thread in these videos so that you can clearly see what's going on. So, let's continue. What I want you to do is to flip over your canvas and make sure that the rest of the canvas is not pulling. Okay, you have to be able to work without anything pulling or pushing. Now, I want you to carefully remove the pin and the lining, like so, and the shoulder piece. But make sure that you don't swap or flip the shoulder piece. You don't want to make that mistake, all right? So just keep it as it's going to be machined. Just push it over to the other side of your machine so that you can first focus on this side. Take your lining. It doesn't matter whether you're working on the wrong side or the right side, but if you want to keep things consistent, just keep the same side upwards, all right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to place the center line of this lining strip on the edge of my canvas, and I'm going to be sewing from this corner right here all the way to the top. This is how we're going to do it. First, position your canvas on the lining. Make sure that you have a little bit extending beyond the points that you're going to start on and finish off with. Then hold it down, go to your starting point, and align the edge of your machine foot to the edge of your canvas, like so. The distance that you're going to sew now is going to be 5 millimeters. We call this a foot's width. Okay, so anytime I say machine foot's width, I mean align the edge of your foot with the edge or line on your material. So let's begin. I have my stitch length on 2, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply run a machine stitch while I'm matching the edge with the center line of the lining all the way up. Be very careful that you're not pulling this edge. This edge is on the bias, and therefore you have to be very careful. Hold everything down with your hands as if you're a spider. So hold things down, make sure the lining doesn't move, and machine. Once you're done, cut your thread, go back to your starting point, and now match your canvas notch to the other notch so that your edges are aligned. Move over to your starting point. Keep these edges very nicely against one another, almost to the point that when they join, they slightly elevate, okay? It's okay to have a 0.5 millimeter overlap. So don't get a gap between them like this. Really push them against one another until they slightly elevate, and again, machine. Foot's width from your starting point all the way to the top. Cut your thread. Flip over. It should be 2 parallel lines without too much wobbles and waves. Now, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your scissors and you're going to trim your lining to 3 millimeters, that's 1/8, away from your edge. All right? Leave this piece on. Don't cut it away. Just trim a little bit from the edge and make sure that the distance between the lining and the thread is 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. Turn it over and do the same on this side. Now I want you to do exactly the same with the other canvas. Once you've done both of the canvases, it is now time to do a zigzag stitch on the lining and the canvas to hold this completely permanent together. If you're using a domestic sewing machine, use the zigzag option that does 3 or 4 stitches to one side and then 3 and 4 stitches to the other. Don't use the one that does 1 stitch here, 1 stitch there, 1 stitch. Have a row of stitches in one direction and another one in the opposite. If you're using a flatbed machine like I am, what you have to do is to release the tension of your foot. This is usually a screw at the top of your sewing machine right here, and all you have to do is to loosen it up so that the foot is not pressing too hard down. If it's pressing too hard down, you will have to pull a lot to move the fabric over sideways, and that's going to really distort your material. So loosen up the foot, and once that is set, you're ready to follow along. If you've never done a zigzag on a flatbed machine, watch me first, try on a piece of scrap, get the hang of it, and then do the zigzag on your canvas. You're going to make sure that your cut edges are facing up and the lining is facing down. You're also going to make sure that the rest of your canvas is not pulling at all. This should be able to sit here without any movement or any push or whatsoever. Then you're going to leave a little bit for your finger to be able to pull the canvas sideways. You are carefully and slowly going to stitch, and as you're stitching in a very consistent rhythm, you're going to back tack and let go, back tack, let go, and at the same time pull the canvas sideways. Don't go up and down with your arm. The machine will do that for you. All you have to do is to hold the canvas, machine consistently on the pedal, press on the pedal, and back tack and let go. Back tack, let go. So this is how it's going to look like. Once you've done a bit, hold it with your hand and go for it. Maybe the foot is a bit too loose. If you don't feel you have any control, tighten up the foot a bit. Once you're done, cut the thread, and you should have something that resembles this. Now, every machine is a bit different. I personally am not used to this machine at all. I use another machine, which is why these zigzag are not perfectly consistent. but you should have roughly a distance of 3/8, which is a centimeter, between each one of these zigzags. Also, notice that I've gone over the 2 rows of machining that we initially did. And the reason for that is so that the edges of the lining are caught and they don't start to fray. So from the lining side, it looks something like this. If you've done it correctly, the shape of the zigzag doesn't really matter. What matters is that your zigzag has not crumpled up the canvas like this, or you haven't been pulling so much that everything is stretched. It should look untouched as what I have in front of me. The shape of the zigzags depends on your machine and of course on how much control you have on that machine. So I'm going to do exactly the same on the other canvas. If you've never done this before, practice first. Now that I've machined this side as well, let's go back to our board and mark and cut our horsehair. All right, so we have machined the shoulder piece to the body, and if you've done everything correctly, you should have 2 symmetrical pairs like this. This is a great opportunity to evaluate something very small, and it's about this corner. Now, this corner is mainly inlay. Everything beyond this line here is inlay. So if you get this perfectly square and aligned with your cut, or you don't get it perfectly aligned and square with your cut, is not really relevant. But if this is your result, I would recommend you try harder to get something like this, okay? Even though it's going to be cut away, once we get to cutting out our darts and stuff, it's best to just have all the cuts sealed and not have them to open up like this, okay? So that's a small evaluation here. Now, the first thing we're gonna do is to, of course, press everything nice and smooth. So get some moisture, simply press everything nice and flat. You should not have a lot of distortions here anyway. And if you do have, then there's something wrong with the tension of your thread on your machine, or you have pulled too much, which means that the foot tension was way too high and you have to loosen that up. But over time, if you practice, you will be able to do this without any distortions. So now that we've done that, let's mark our horsehair on one of these canvases and then mark it on the actual horsehair material and then cut it out. So this is what we're going to do. Take a pencil and a ruler and mark 1.5 inches above your intake point. That's about 4 centimeters, like so. Take this point and find the middle, mark that and draw a straight line from this middle point through the 1.5 inches above the intake point all the way to the front, okay? So you don't have to even think about this. All you have to think about are these 2 points. And your line is going to be perfectly straight. Now you can extend your break line so that you have it in the shoulder area as well. And now it's time to mark the grain of the horsehair. Now, we know that this is already on the bias based on the shoulder angle, okay? So the opposite of that is also going to be on the bias. If I go perpendicular to this grain, I'm going to have my bias in the opposite direction. We want the horsehair to be following this grain. So the strongest yarns, which are the horsehair, are going to be in this direction. The reason for that I have already explained in lesson number 13, Canvas Construction Theory, but to just give you a reminder, we don't want to create excess work. So if we would cut the horsehair the same as the body, we would have to add an extra piece on the horsehair, cut that out, and then again machine it like we did on the canvas, and we'd have all these patchwork going on. Now, another way to do it is to simply take the horsehair and put it on the bias so that the entire piece is on the bias and thereby also your shoulder, and at the same time have a different way of allowing the horsehair to collapse, which is going to create a hollow shape on the sides of the jacket, which is going to be very elegant looking. So that's the reason. Take this off and bring your horsehair, and the first thing we're going to do is to press this smooth and make sure that the grain is perfectly straight. Sometimes the horsehair grains curve inwards or outwards or sideways, and we want to correct that as much as we can before we mark and cut out the horsehair. So you can, if you want, take an L square and place it underneath it and make sure that the selvage is running parallel to your ruler so you don't end up with a horsehair that's doing this. Now take your canvas and position it on your horsehair so that the grain that we marked in the shoulder matches the grain of the horsehair, okay? Now we want to push this as high as we can, even if it means that we miss a little bit in that corner. This corner is mainly inlay. If you remember, we added 1/2 inch on this side. So we can afford to lose a little bit in this corner, which is going to be trimmed anyway. And we want to create as much space as we can in the lapel area, all right? So if I have to give you concrete measures, the amount that I allow to go out from the selvage is about 1.5 inches. That's 4 centimeters. And roughly speaking, the same is true here. Once you've positioned it, make sure that your line is, of course, covering the horsehair, so you don't go over it, and it's on the horsehair. And if the grain and all matches, it's time to mark everything. Take your pencil, mark the break line. Mark the shoulder exactly as the canvas is without adding any inlays, and the front side. Something I forgot to mark, we need to add a line that's about 3/8 or 1 centimeter away from the edge of the horsehair. So like that. So don't mark all the way to the edge. Just mark this line, mark it underneath it, like so. At the same time, mark the line that you have here, like so. And also mark the front of your straight line, which is going to be on the grain, more or less. That's it. So now we can remove the canvas and solidify our lines. And the first line that I'm going to draw is the break line. Then we have the bottom. The rest you can just follow as you're cutting. Now, we need to add 1/2 inch, that's 1.2 centimeters, in front of the break line. The reason why we add this is it will make it easier for us to mark the break line from the right side once we want to apply the bridle. But we'll get to that. Cut out the horsehair and try to just cut on your lines. Don't make cuts any further than you have to. That will help you to save a lot of material. Shoulder, armhole. If you ever cut your material on top of another material, be very careful you don't cut both at the same time. If you have a very sharp pair of scissors, that can happen very easily. So always be paranoid and double check. And then last but not least, the bottom of the chest piece. One of the things that you may notice is that I didn't cut exactly on the line. The reason for that is that this line is so close to the grain that if I follow along with that grain, I can easily take one of these hairs out and go all the way and fray it without actually creating jagged lines. If that happens to you, just follow the grain. That 1 or 2 millimeters is not going to do any harm. And then what you can do is to take a few of these horsehairs out. That is going to fray the bottom edge of your chest piece and is going to allow for a slightly smoother transition. But it's neglectable, it's not enough, but it's just good not to have any sharp hairs sticking out in this area. So this is what we're going to do. You're going to take your horsehair piece and you're going to bring this down, align the edges and the corners of the shoulder, okay? And make sure that the grain is matching. Sometimes the other side of your horsehair has the grain going slightly in a different direction. So don't match exactly the edge and assume that that's fine. Always keep the grain as a priority. Put a weight on it and cut nice and neatly around your horsehair. Again, don't cut any more than you need to. And of course the bottom. And here you can just remove the top layer and follow one of these straight grains. Once you've done that, remove some of the horsehairs. You can also use a needle to bring them out. And that's it. Now, what I want you to do is to place these two on top of one another so that you can make a small snip right at the top and the bottom to mark the break line on the other side of your layer. Match the outer lines and small cut here. small cut here. Flip it over, take your ruler and your pencil and mark a line. Now what we need is our next shoulder piece. And the way that's going to work is the following. Cut these pieces away from this strip, put them on top of one another, and position the horsehair grain so that it runs perpendicular to the grain that you have on your chest piece. Now you may have to do this or you may have to do this to get the best result, but I recommend you do it like this. It's better to have a wider piece on the front towards the break line, then slightly narrow that down towards the shoulder. Now get as much as you can of your width on the actual shoulder, so don't position it like this. Position it about 1 centimeter or 3/8 behind your break line. Bring it a little bit lower. Take your ruler, and we know that about 1/2 inch of this horsehair is our inlay. So we reduce that. We also know that we've added 3/4 to the actual fabric on the shoulder line. So that's going to be about here. So the true shoulder line is, roughly speaking, going to be somewhere here, which is about 1.5 inches away from the edge of the horsehair. Okay. Now we want this to cover the true shoulder line and a little bit above that. So you can bring this 1/2 inch lower. Make sure it's perpendicular to the grain of your chest piece. And then measure 4 inches down from the front near the break line. That's from the edge of your extra shoulder piece. 4 inches down. And then from here, well, let's see, where does that go? So that's about here, that's about here. Make that 3 inches from the edge of your extra shoulder piece. And then draw a straight line between these two, and you can then simply mark the edges of your horsehair and cut. And try to make this a nice straight line as well if you have any raw edges like I have here. Let's recap this before we go ahead and cut out our extra Silesia piece, which is going to be on the side. Let me clear my board. Now, this is what's going to happen. Here we have our body canvas. The grain of our body canvas is on the straight in the body area and on the bias, angling downwards towards the front side in the shoulder piece. Our horsehair is going to be fitting on it like this. And the horsehair is going to be pushing the shoulder piece upwards while the canvas is going to pushing it downwards. What do I mean by that? Well, if I would roll this up in my hand along my shoulder line, what's going to happen is the horsehair wants to push everything in this direction. So look at the collapse here. If I let it go, it twists in this direction. It collapses in that direction. Now, we do not want this to happen too much on our shoulder. What we want is what the body canvas grain is doing in the shoulder. So if I hold this up and I kind of like bend it, automatically it rolls like this. It rolls downwards. We want this to happen and encourage that because our shoulder naturally has this forward movement. So if our horsehair, which is a lot stronger than our canvas, by the way, is going to be pushing the shoulder upwards, we want to neutralize that and reinforce this grain that we have here by adding this extra piece on the shoulder, which is also pointing down, not up, okay? Down. So when that happens, now, because the canvas grain and the horsehair grain are doubled, and this is just on its own, we're going to have a little bit more encouragement and strength in that direction. So by the time this folds over, the shoulder is more likely to collapse forwards than upwards, okay? Now you may think, but isn't this a pagoda shoulder? Shouldn't it go upwards? That is not related to the construction of the canvas per se. That upwards flick is due to the shape of the seam, not the shape of the surface per se. We still want to have an upward movement, but also a forward movement. The forward movement gives the comfort. It's a very technical reason. Okay, that is what's, roughly speaking, the construction of our canvas looks like. All we are going to need now is an extra piece here, which is cut out from Silesia. So how do we mark that? Well, let's put all our components together and away, and now mark the Silesia piece. So the Silesia piece is very simple. It is about 5 millimeters or a quarter above the intake line. So you can mark that with your pencil, like so. It follows the center line of the dart up, and then it starts to curve towards this cut that we have here. So if I would draw that with a piece of graphite, like so. Now what this is going to do exactly, again, I've explained that thoroughly in lesson number 13, canvas construction theory, and I will demonstrate that in a second to you, but first let's mark the grain so that we can cut it out and look at it. So take a protractor and mark a 45 degrees through the horizontal grain of the canvas. So like this. The direction of the grain doesn't really matter. It can be like that or like that. Silesia is fairly uniform across the weave. It's not like horsehair or the body canvas whereby one yarn is stronger than the other. Both of them are more or less the same. So this is what we're going to cut out. Take your Silesia, open it up, remove your canvas from underneath it, press it smooth. We're going to need one of these corners. So if you have the selvage facing you, we can use the left corner. Take your canvas and position your canvas so that your Silesia piece is matching either the warp or the weft. So this is now aligned with my selvage. Put a weight on, take your chalk and begin marking the outlines. You can use pins if you want to transfer that point through. And of course the outlines. Remove your canvas, connect the dots and cut it out. Put your Silesia away. Now before we continue, this step is going to be very important. Take your iron and make sure that the Silesia gets hot and then spray some water on it. Look at that. Do the same thing on the other side. Press again, but don't leave the entire weight of your iron on the Silesia. Just gently hold it up and go lightly over it and keep on the move. Don't stay on one place. And as it gets drier, you can then leave your iron on and simply move around slower. Now, if you're wondering, can I soak the Silesia and not do this? The answer is yes, to some extent. You can soak your Silesia and get all of that shrinkage. It's usually not done because it requires a lot of water, it requires a lot of time to dry. This is a faster process, and because there isn't a lot of starch on the Silesia, you can do that a lot easier without the iron burning things on it, etc. But even if you have soaked it, I still do recommend you go through this process to make sure that there isn't going to be unexpected shrinkage in your material. What is this going to do and how are we going to use it? Take our canvas again. This is going to fall right on this place, okay? Of course, single layer. Now, the direction of the grain is so that the bias is across the chest, okay? Along with the same grain as the body canvas. We need this flexibility in this area because what we're going to do is we're going to put this on our canvas, cover it with our horsehair, have our extra shoulder piece on top. Now, this area is going to be padded in a curve like this. Because it's stiff and curved in the opposite direction, it's going to act like a lever and it's going to go like that and push the chest forwards and hollow the sides. Now the grain of the horsehair being positioned on the bias as well is going to be also helping that effect because it now is very easily, look at that, you see that hollowness? It's curling and collapsing in a hollow line as well. So this all adds to a very athletic look on the sides of the chest. If our horsehair, like the traditional model, was matching the same grain as the body canvas and it would bend, you see that it bends in like a straight tube. It doesn't bend in like a nice elegant curve as the grain does. So see the difference. If I do this, you get a curve. If I do this, you get a bubble, like a tube. And I'm not manipulating it in any way here. 2 fingers here and 2 fingers here. All right? So all of that is there to enhance the look of the chest. That's all. Once we have padded this, I'll show you. Now, we have cut everything out that we need so far, and we're going to baste everything together. Take your canvas and make sure that the raw edge side of your shoulder piece is facing up and the lining facing down, like so. Then take your ruler and mark 1.5 inches above the intake point of your dart. Extend your break line. Take your Silesia piece and position it so that it's about 5 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch above the intake point. Okay? Now it's time to baste. If you've got the Improvers bundle, inside that bundle, you will find this beautiful basting thread, suitable for basting. This is the thread that I'm going to be using in the video. It's very easy to break and it's also easy to take out. Now, if you turn it over, similar to the mark stitching thread, it has a small flap that says number 5 betweens needle. And if you flip it over, you have 2 number 5 betweens needles in there. I recommend you take them out, put them on the top of your spool, take the paper out as well. You can easily just slide it off and start using it. That's it. If you don't have our bundle, use a very easy to break thread. Don't use machine thread or some other thick thread that's super difficult to break, because that may damage your fabric, but also be very difficult to take out. So it should be very easy to break with your fingers, as if you're just breaking a yarn, like that. No power needed. A baby should be able to break it, okay? Thread your needle. This is the first baste that you're going to do. It's going to be right on this curve without any fastening on or fastening off. Keep your stitches big, because we don't want this layer to be held too tightly against the canvas. And cut. Trim this as well. Don't leave too long ends. Take the horsehair that has marked the break line with pencil and position it so that the edge of your horsehair is aligned with that 1.5 inches upwards from the intake point, like so. Make sure the break line is matching while you're doing that, like so. Thread your needle and start basting and matching the break lines together. No fastening on or off. The stitch length is about 1 inch, that's 2.5 centimeters. And we're going to do one baste right through the middle, again, not fastening on or off. The edge of your horsehair at the bottom should be more or less on that mark. If it moves 1 or 2 millimeters up, that's absolutely fine. But if it moves any further than that, upwards or downwards, take your bastings out, reposition the horsehair, and do it again. So now it's time for our extra shoulder piece. Make sure that the grain is perpendicular to the grain of your chest piece and that the wider part is towards the break line. Okay? Now, where are we going to position this? It has to be 3/8, which is 1 centimeter, behind the break line and about 1/2 inch below the edge of your body canvas. So mark where that is. Mark 1/2 inch underneath it, like so. That's about 1.2 centimeters. Position it right there. Now, if it's the case that by matching the tops, you are changing the direction of the horsehair so that it's not perpendicular to the grain anymore, forget about the top, just match the front and focus on the grain, like so. Let's baste it. Start from the top, baste through all layers, and then baste across. And you can then cut it without fastening off. So that is so far the construction of our canvas. Later, when we get to finish the jacket, we are going to have an extra piece of canvas in the lapel as well, but for a fitting that is completely unnecessary because the lapel is not going to be padded yet. Now, before I cut and baste the domette on, I'm going to do exactly the same to the other side. So that's that. Double check, please. Does what you have in front of you look like what I have in front of me? If so, then get this out of the way, clear up your board because it's time to mark and baste on the domette. Make sure your board is completely clean. We don't want to have pieces of canvas or horsehair inside our domette. So, clear board. Grab your domette, fold it open, like so, and have the selvage on your right-hand side. All right? Now, we're going to take our canvas and align the grain of the horsehair chest piece with the grain or the fold or the selvage of our domette. And we're going to do that in this way. We need at least ½ inch below the edge of our horsehair. So make sure that you have at least ½ inch. Give it a little bit more, maybe 3/4. So you can always trim it off later. And we need just that point corner matching with the edge of our domette. So like that. Now we have a big piece of domette because we're going to use domette for the making of our shoulder pads. We're going to cut out wing pads, and of course that requires more material. But for now, this is what we're going to do, and it's going to be cutting out the domette that covers the entire chest piece. Please do not use blue, red, or yellow chalk. It's disgusting. You can't get it out, and it's going to make your work ugly. You don't want that. Either use your white chalk and just make a bit more effort to see where the lines are, or use a thin pencil that doesn't leave thick black marks. For the purpose of this lesson, I'm going to use graphite so that you can see what I'm marking. Normally, I would use white chalk. So let's do this. Make sure you have 3/4, that's 2 centimeters from the edge of your horsehair to the edge of your fold, at the top and at the bottom. Then mark 3/8, that's 1 centimeters, above the shoulder, around the sides, like so, and along the edge of your chest piece. So not the break line, but the edge, and right here. Remove your canvas, mark a straight line for the break line, and carefully cut out your domette. Remove the rest of the domette, we're not going to need it for now, and cut out the rest of the side. Cut very closely to the edge so that you separate both of these pieces. You can cut through the fold. I always find it easier to just cut very closely to the edge and separate them like that. Now we have cut out our domette. Because we aligned it with the grain of our horsehair, the shoulder piece is also on the bias along with the rest of the domette. So let's baste this on our canvas. Take your canvas, put your domette on, take the top layer off, and now you have the nice and clean inside of the domette facing upward. Now I want you to position the domette so that the edge of the break line is matching the edge of that break line inlay as we marked, like so, and that you have at least ½ inch over your horsehair. If it's more, that's okay. We will trim that off. Just make sure that every side is covered, and we are now ready to baste. So how are we going to baste? We are going to mark the break line and then 3/4, that's 2 centimeters behind it. So if this is the break line, this is going to be 2 centimeters behind it, and the same goes right here at the bottom. Now normally, again, I would do this with white chalk, but I'm doing this with a pencil so that it's visible. Connect this with a line and baste on top of that. Before we continue, what I want you to do is to measure from the edge of your canvas, that's here, 2 inches in, and from the top edge of your canvas, that was the armhole edge, so the shoulder edge, which is here, 2 inches down, which brings us on this point, and then from this point, we're going to curve into that 1 inch inlay that we added. So if this is the edge of our canvas, we added 1 inch to that, which is all inlay. So we're going to move 1 inch back, and the same goes for here, and the same goes for here. And we're going to connect that like so to the actual true edge of our front side. Now we're also going to measure 2 inches down from the edge at the front and connect that to the line that we have right here. We don't want to waste our time padding areas that are going to be cut out. So we leave that free and pad those areas once we are finishing the jacket if we have to. Now, as for here, this is going to be the edge of the horsehair. And we want to be 1/2 inch, that's 1.2 centimeters below that. This is how we're going to baste. Baste starting at the very top, fasten on once. Don't make your bite too small because you'll struggle taking out that bite. And baste downwards with a stitch length of 1 inch. Now, don't baste all the way down. Baste just above the line that we're going to cut now, because if you baste all the way down, you will be cutting your stitches as well. So baste close, but not all the way to that line. And big back tack. Now, the next basting line is going to be right from the top on this curve towards the edge and then downwards. So like this. However, be careful that you don't baste on the horsehair if it has exceeded your body canvas. Your starting point should always be your body canvas, okay? Fasten off with a big bite. Don't pull the thread too tight. Stitch length 1 inch. Here around the curve, you can reduce the size of your stitch length and stop before the line that is going to be cut. Like so. Fasten off, cut the thread, and now it's time to cut this line. Be very, 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 very careful not to cut your Silesia. What you can do, if you want, is to flip it over, lift this up like so, hold it down, and then cut 3/8 or 1/2 inch away from the edge of your horsehair. You can also do that if you're working very quickly and you already know what you're doing and all of that. So as for now, for instructions' sake, I will do this. Just be very careful for the Silesia. Put your finger on it so that you remind yourself of what you're doing. Careful, lift it up and continue. The last thing we're going to do is to flip this over and cut everything net to the edge of the body canvas. That's it. Now, I'm going to be doing exactly the same on the other side, and then we're ready to pad. Before I do that, you may wonder, why did we use domette to cover the horsehair? The answer to that is the horsehair itself. We are going to take a dart out on the chest and on the front of our panel. We are also going to cut the horsehair, once we have canvassed our forepart, 3/8 behind the break line. We are also going to have all of the armhole area trimmed away once the jacket is finished, and the same goes for the shoulder. Now, horsehair, if you feel that, is very, very rigid. It almost hurts. So, if you have raw edges of horsehair rubbing against the fabric or the lining of your jacket, two things will happen. Either the material is going to wear off over time, so imagine this rubbing against your lining all the time. And two, some of these individual hairs can stick out and poke through the lining into your chest. It is an extremely uncomfortable feeling. If you ever make a base fitting for yourself and you put the jacket on, you will notice that the neck area being exposed will rub against your neck, and it's going to be a very uncomfortable feeling. It's like a blade against your neck. So, domette, being thick and fluffy, will prevent and cover the horsehair from poking through. Sometimes tailors will use a strip of Silesia, cotton, linen, lining, whatever. But in my opinion, domette, being thick and fluffy, is the best cover for horsehair. So that's why. I've basted the domette on both of these panels, and what you should have is something like this. What I'd like to mention is that please don't do anything on the sides yet in terms of trimming and shortening these layers, because as we're going to pad this in a curve, all of these layers are going to shift inwards, and we want to do the trimming once that shifting has happened. So now what we're going to do is to mark the domette so that we can start our padding. We only need one line to mark, and everything else is going to follow from that. Also, we are going to pad inside the area that we have marked and basted on. So all these areas around our panel is not going to be padded. So take a ruler and a pencil, align your ruler with your break line, move your ruler over so that you have split the forepart into two equal sides. Now, of course, the shape is not symmetrical, so it may look a bit odd, but I would say, roughly speaking, this is the middle. The direction of your padding isn't really that relevant. If you do your padding correctly, meaning the bite size is correct, the tension is not too tight, you haven't held the canvas in an awkward way, and you've just held it nice and flat, then you can pad in any direction. You can pad any shape, any color whatsoever. The reason why I'm choosing the break line as a reference is because once we go up and down and we end right on the break line, we're going to have a very nice line of padding that finishes off right at that line. If we go in any other direction, we're going to have awkwardnesses right around this break line, and it's not going to look that neat. So let's do this. Again, I recommend you mark with a chalk so that you don't have these ugly lines on your domette. And now what I want you to do is to take machine thread, a number 7 betweens needle, which is not a very big needle, but neither is it going to be a tiny small needle, and begin padding your canvas in the way that I'm going to show you. If you've got the Improvers bundle, you'll have your machine thread that matches the color of the fabric. I want you to use this thread for padding your canvases. The number 7 needle can be found on your yarn card that says waxed silamide. Now, I don't want you to use the thread yet on this card. Simply take out one of the needles, use the needle for padding your canvases, and then once you're done, just put it back in and wait for further instructions on this card. All right, so if you want to see an in-depth video on how to do a padding stitch, what it is, what it's based on, what the principles are, check out our lesson on how to do a padding stitch before you start. That is, of course, assuming that you haven't got a lot of experience and you haven't done a padding stitch yet. But I assume you know to some extent what it is, but please go through that entire lesson and then go through this. All right? Take one of the canvases out of your way. Then, to make things easier, roll up the bottom of your canvas, like so. You don't want things to be flapping around as you're working. Pin it up, but leave some space between the roll and, of course, the area that you're going to pad. And do the same for the lapel. Fold it in half and then in half again. Pin it up. And now we are ready to pad our first side. Start off a little further than you want to actually begin. So, if we say that this is where we want to begin, bring your needle in between the layers, a little bit further out, go through the layers in between without having your needle visible on this side. Come out of that point, pull your thread until it's hidden underneath the domette, and then go right into the point where you came out, take a small bite, like this, gently pull but not too hard, and go down and pad your way up and down with a stitch length of 3/8, like that. So, let's go. Let's do a few recaps. Once you establish your center line, you're always going to work from the center outwards. If you're right-handed, that will be from right to left. If you're left-handed, from left to right. When you reach the bottom, make sure that you go one stitch over the edge of the domette to keep the edge of the domette down. You don't want the edge of the domette rolling upwards, okay? Now, when you move upwards, follow the same angle as your previous stitch. Keep the same distance as your bite size from the stitch. Find the middle between the two previous bites and pad your way upwards. So when you have gone from up to down and down to up, your stitches should look like this. If you notice, when I follow the previous stitch going upwards, the place where my needle goes in between these two stitches above it is going to be exactly where I put my needle in and take my next bite. Okay, study this, please. Don't do stitches where the distance between the bites are like this big. Don't do this. That's not how I've taught you to pad. Follow along, study exactly what I'm saying, what I'm doing, and replicate it as accurately as you can. So let's say my thread is ending and I want to finish off. This is what you're going to do. Right where you came out with your thread, go back in there between a few layers, but not through all of them, and move a little bit outwards. Come out, and now your thread is hidden. We want to make the stitches look like one continuous stitch. Therefore, I don't fasten off 3 times on the same spot because I think it's just outright ugly. So what you'll do is the same as you did in the beginning. Imagine that we want to come out here and start our new bite. So insert your needle further out in between the layers, come out of the first dot of your bite, like so, hide the thread, go right behind where you came out with your thread, and then take a bite, and you can continue. And as you can see, it looks like one continuous thread. You can't tell where you've stopped and started. Now, another thing, please, as you're holding the canvas, don't crumple up the canvas and overwork the canvas. Keep it light, as if you're just holding it between your 2 fingers right here, the middle finger and the thumb. Just be very light and easy. Don't try to squash it and take all the juices out of it, you know? Keep the canvas flat until I instruct you to do otherwise. You're not supposed to curve the canvas like this while you're padding. The only area that we're going to do that on is going to be on this side because we have a special construction for it. Everything else is just going to be as flat as you can. Another thing, which is very important, try to push the needle all the way outwards before you grab it and continue with your next stitch. If you grab the needle too quickly, so you do this, like so, and then you try to grab it, what you're going to do is you're going to start picking the fluff of the domette, and every time you continue your stitch, that fluff is going to stay on your fingers. Now the needle goes through it and the thread picks it up, and then the thread is going to bring it on the other side, and you may end up with big domette bubbles on the right side of your canvas. Always push your needle all the way outwards and then grab it from the tip so that you don't pick up fluff. Keep the tension nice and easy. You should be able to do this, and the threads go left and right. They're not pulled so tight that they have sunk into the domette, and go all the way up and down. Stop right at the break line marking that we have, and we'll catch up there. As you're padding, one of the things that you may notice or may not notice is your posture. Keep everything that I said in lesson number 10 about posture in your mind. Never have the work too far away from you that you end up padding like this. Don't have it too close so that you end up bending yourself like a snake. And at the same time, if you want to lean forwards, lean on your leg. Don't lean on your back. Don't bend your back and hang over the work. Just rest on your leg. If your leg gets tired, switch the leg and just continue. Padding stitch takes a long time. So it's the perfect moment to practice the right posture, to make it a habit, and then forget about it. You'll always have a good posture, okay? It's always good to look professional and to be professional as you're doing the actual work. We have padded one side, and now it's time to pad the side where we have the Silesia piece. The first thing you have to do is to mark where this Silesia piece is on your domette. Simply mark the top and roughly from your memory make that shape that we had for the Silesia piece. Now, this is what I want you to do. Flip over, pad all these other areas, just as we did with the front. But as soon as you get into this area, I want you to flip the canvas over, roll the canvas like this, okay? And then pad. Pad, pad, pad. And as soon as you get away from this area and you fall into the area outside the line, go back to normal, okay? I'm going to demonstrate it to you when I get close to here. And you have to pad all the way to the edge of your Silesia and go one stitch over it, just like we did on the domette. So I've approached the line of the Silesia piece. I'm going to go all the way down, and as soon as I go back up, I will start curving the canvas. Flip the canvas over, hold it in a curve and pad until you reach again the line which indicates the area of the Silesia. And then you go flat again. And now here I've reached that line, so I'll take my last bite and then go flat. You're going to repeat that all the way until you are just in this area, and then you can just keep it on a curve. The main thing is that as you're holding this in a curve, you don't trap bubbles of canvas like this in your padding. It should be all very smooth and sitting nicely against one another. If this starts to annoy you, just simply open it up, let it go, and that should make it easier for you to flip this over if you have to. As you get closer to the edge, what you'll notice is this bubble appearing because the fabric cannot escape the area that is basted down. All you have to do is simply cut your thread in that area and take it out. And now that bubble will disappear. And as you're rolling, these layers will begin to shift inwards. So if you remember, this was way over the edge of our canvas, this domette, and now it's falling on the inside. We're going to continue, and when we get a little closer, we're going to do the final layering of our materials, and that would be it. Now that I'm very close to the edge, I'm going to trim everything nice and neatly away from the edge and have them layered. So the horsehair is already about 1 centimeter or 3/8 behind. The Silesia, by the time we're done, is going to be about 3 millimeters away from the edge. So the only thing that I really have to trim neat is going to be the domette. And I can simply trim the domette to be about 5 millimeters shorter than the Silesia. So gently and slowly trim the uneven part, and that's it. And I'm going to pad all the way to the edge. And that is one side done. Now, if you look at this, this is rolling the opposite direction. Someone looking at this might think we're crazy doing this, but what's going to happen is by the time this folds over the body like this, it's going to push the chest forwards. Of course, it's going to be a bit smoother than this because it's going to be pressed and there's going to be fabric on it. It's going to push the chest forwards and have a very hollow side on the body. All right, so take out your bastings. You can simply take a pin, hook it against one of the bastings, and because we haven't done a fastening on and off, you can simply just pull them, and if they haven't been caught by your padding stitches, it should be very easy to pull them out. And that's it. Take the pins out, give it a dry press for now. It's okay to flatten this, put this away, and do exactly the same with your other canvas. As you get into the flow of working on your canvas, you may take a few bites and then pull your thread all at once. I do not recommend you do that. The reason for that is that the first stitch is going to be very loose. The third stitch, having to pull a little bit more, is going to be tight. So your stitches are not going to have the same consistent tension. And it's always better to simply take a bite, pull, and then do the same on the next one. Okay, so let's do a quick evaluation here. If you've pressed your canvases with a dry iron and you look at your canvases from the right side, what you should see is tiny dots of thread that are not distorting the canvas in any way. Just exactly like what I have here in these areas. Now, something you have to be careful for, as I already mentioned, because we have an extra layer of horsehair in the shoulders, it may be that as you are getting up in this area, your bite size becomes bigger. So your stitches spread open and the pattern does not look even. And at the same time, if you look at it from this side, you'll see that the dots of thread showing become smaller and smaller. Now, this is pretty good because every stitch is visible to the extent that it has caught 1 or 2 yarns. But if it gets any less than that and they become almost invisible, then it means that you need to take a slightly bigger bite from this side, but still keep the same bite size from this end, so that the pattern does not distort and the bite size doesn't change either. Then we have this side shield area, which again, because we are holding it in a curve, may cause you to take a smaller bite, just like what I have here. Now, I wouldn't say that this is ideal. So this area is a lot better and this area is a lot better than what you see here. But because it's a small area, I wouldn't redo it. If it's a large area, so this entire area is super small and inconsistent, I would completely redo it. If I go with my finger over it, I can still see that the threads are holding the layers together. But if the entire area was almost invisible, I would redo it because that's not going to be strong enough. When looking at your canvas from this side, of course, we're going to have relative layer length going on here, which makes this side longer than this side. So it's natural for you to see waves and ripples because, of course, a longer material is now forced to be flat and that results in these waves. However, if you hold the canvas in a curve, you should not see any ripples or any distortions. All right? So that's that. The other thing is your stitch tension. If your canvas looks like it's doing this and it's kind of like being drawn together, it means that all your stitches are very tight. That's not good. I would take every stitch out and redo the entire thing with a looser tension. You should be able to run your fingers over your stitches and see the threads slightly move. Now, you don't want them to be so loose that you can actually hook your finger underneath it, but there should be some give in the threads. So all in all, if what you have looks like what I have from this side and this side, then you're on the right track. Now let's pick it up and have a look at this. If I hold this canvas up without the darts being taken out and I slightly push on the side here, what you see is a concave hollow break right in the middle of the chest. Now, we have used relative layer length to somewhat program the canvas to do this because we want the chest to be pushed out and the sides to be kept flat and a bit hollow against the sides of the chest. If you compare this to the traditional model, and I do exactly the same on the traditional model, you don't see any of that hollowness happening there. The traditional model simply breaks right on the side and has a bit of a round chest. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different style feature, okay? So, of course, this is not going to be like this around our body because our body is not so narrow. But even if it goes around and it breaks on the edges here, you can still see somewhat a hollow break, which of course adds to the style. Now, once we take the front side and the front dart out, those are going to bend the canvas from the middle and keep the sides nice and flat and to some extent hollow against the sides of the chest. So let's take those darts out and evaluate it again. Take both of your canvases and position them so that the domette side is facing each other, like so. Make sure there are no folds. Then turn them over so that the sides are facing you and the shoulder is on your left hand side. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pin the intake point, the top of the dart, the button and the break line together so that they are exactly matching one another. The easiest way is to start with the first button. Match the first button, flatten both sides. Then let's see if we can get this point to match. Put a pin straight through it, like so. Then as you're holding the pin down, lift up the work and see if the pin goes right through the intake point on the other side. If it doesn't do that, you may have to move it around, look at it again, and do this until it is exactly matching that point. So that's a lot better. Now, one thing I do not recommend is you try to lift up the work and then do this. Why? Well, of course, relative layer length. You're making one of them shorter, and so you're not going to have a very accurate match. It should always be flat on your board, and your needle should go right straight through it. Once you have matched these two, put your finger on top and put a needle a little bit lower than that point, because we're going to cut into this point. There should be no bubbles between your pins. If everything is matching, but you have a massive bubble in between them, something is wrong. In that case, I recommend you just start with the dart at the intake point and at the top and leave that button to go wherever it goes. This is more important than that. So let's do the top point of the dart. So that's perfectly matching. As I keep the pin in there, I hold it down and put the pin a little bit more forwards to keep it free of that area. So again, no bubbles between your pins. Time for the brake line. Let's start at the top of the brake line, put a pin through it, and see if that pin is right on the brake line on the other side. And it exactly is. So that's fine. Now we can put a pin in the middle and see if that's the case as well. Yes, that's absolutely fine. Now we can mark and cut the darts. So what do? We take a pencil. Make sure that your pencil is very sharp. Take your ruler. Where you have this edge of your step, on that line, you're going to measure 3/8, that's 1 centimeters, on either side of the center line of your dart. This is the same amount of intake as we have on our pattern. Then we will connect them to the top point of the dart and make sure that the point of the dart is marked as accurately as you can. You do not need to raise the point or lower the point to do some fancy combinations. Just have it exactly the same as the pattern and your forepart. Now it's time to mark our side dart. We have marked the out breast welt base so that we don't mark the dart into that area. Why? Once we get to do the out breast welt pocket, we're going to cut through the canvas so that we can machine the welt through the canvas but not through the horsehair. So the horsehair is going to be cut like a window and folded up. We do not want to unpick the lining that closes the dart in that area. So we are going to stay away from that area. The first thing we have to do is to mark the true edge of the armhole to know exactly where our inlay area is. All of this is going to be trimmed away. So we do not want to have our intake starting from here. We want our intake to be calculated and marked right on the true edge of our armhole. This edge is the raw edge of our pattern on our forepart. So it's not inlay. What you're going to do is the following. You're going to add right on the most severe part of this curve, which is roughly speaking here, one tiny marking like this. And on either side of that marking, you're going to add a quarter. So that's about 6 millimeters. Then it's time to mark the center line of this dart. That is going to be very simple. We want the center line to point towards the top point of our front dart here. But we don't want to take it all the way up to there because then we're going to create a cone and we don't want a cone. So we're going to just go simply in between the edge of our armhole and the top point of our front dart, which is going to be roughly speaking somewhere here. Mark a line and connect those 2 points, those intake points, to that point. You will notice that the intake gets bigger when we get to the edge of the inlay, but that's not really important because that's inlay and it's going to be trimmed away. Something that I have to add is that this dart is now functioning purely as a style feature. I do not have a big chest that requires a big dart. This is just to bring out the chest a little bit more, to exaggerate the silhouette. That's all. Take your shears, hold your hands on the material so that nothing moves, and cut through both layers. If you don't have very sharp points and you get to the end of your cutting, just use your finger to push that down so that you don't end up chewing that last bit. And make sure that your shears are dead straight. Because you have a lot of layers, if you hold them on an angle, you're going to have the top layer shorter and the bottom layer longer, or depending on how you hold it. So keep them as dead straight as you can. You see, this is now difficult to cut, so I'll just use my finger to cut through all these layers. Try to have this top point of your dart as smoothly cut as possible. Don't have like a square here because you didn't manage to cut nicely. Now it's time to cut out the strips that we're going to use to close these darts. Put your canvas aside, grab your lining, and bring up the edge where we have already cut a strip for when we join the shoulder piece to the body of the canvas. That is going to be at the end of your lining, perpendicular to the selvage. We need a few strips to close the darts. What we're going to do is to machine those strips while we close these edges and bring them together, and then zigzag over them just like we did here. Now these strips have to be on the straight grain because if it's on the bias, of course, due to the flexibility, the cuts may open up and then we'll end up with a gap between them, which is going to cause the canvas to break. We do not want that. We want the tightly woven straight grain to hold everything nicely together. How long do these strips have to be? Well, they have to be the same length as the darts plus 1.25 inches or something like that. It could be 1.5 inches, not too long. A little bit longer so that we have some room to play around with. Now, both of these darts are about 4 inches. That's 10 centimeters, roughly speaking. So we need about 1 inch, 1.25 inches on either side, and that makes our strips about 7 inches, which is going to be around 18 centimeters. We're going to cut them at 1 inch wide, and that should be it. Now, we need 2 strips, because we have 2 darts, to cover the outside, and 2 strips to cover the inside. So 4 for each side, 8 in total. If you want to know exactly where the straight grain is on your lining, the easiest way to find out is to take a pin, to pick up your lining, and then just take a yarn across out. So if I pull this one yarn and I move everything over, and then I just pull and break that yarn, I can simply move everything back, and now I have this line going through my lining, which indicates exactly where the straight grain is. That's a cool trick to know if you ever need to cut something on the straight grain. Because as you can see, lining moves and it looks straight. Look at that. That's one big curve, but it's definitely not on the straight grain. So bring everything there, straighten it all up, match the edges, double check to see if this line is straight. Your line may be somewhere else. And then it's time to mark and cut our strips. 1 inch wide, that should be sufficient. And then we simply have to measure about 18 centimeters or 7 inches. And now we know that we already have 2. We need another 2. So now we've got 4, and that covers one of our panels. We need 4 more. Keep these together. Remove your lining. And now it's time to fold the edges of 4 of our strips. The strips with the folded edges are going to cover the inside of our canvas. Now, we don't have to fold the edges in, but it makes everything look a lot nicer. What do we have to do? Is very simple. Take one of these strips, make sure you have the wrong side facing up, fold one edge about 5 millimeters in, crease with your iron as you're holding a little bit tension on it to keep that line straight. Turn it over and do the same thing on the other side. Press it from the other side, and that's it. Now, if for whatever reason you have a slight overlap like I have here, what you can do is bring your scissors right in between the 2 edges and make a cutting move all the way upwards and cut away that excess. Hold it, blow against it, that's going to go away. And now we have prepared one of these. So once we have zigzagged the outside, these folded edges are going to beautifully cover the inside and give it a very nice finish. Let's do the rest. If you want to know which side is the right side, that really depends on your light. But as far as I can tell, the side that shines more is the wrong side. You also should see the twill diagonal weave a lot better on the right side. So now that we've got all our strips, let's go to the machine to close these darts up. If you're wondering why did we fold the inside ones and not the outside ones, well, the reason is that this side is where our fabric is going to sit on. It's not going to be visible during, for example, the fittings if you're working for a customer. And you want this to be as flat as possible. So because the inside is going to be temporarily visible, it's a good idea to make it look as beautiful as possible to really reflect that finesse. All right, we're ready to take our darts out. Take one of your canvases and have the domette side up. We're going to start with the front dart. It doesn't matter which dart you start with, but the front dart is a good place to begin. Now I'm going to use white thread so that you can see exactly what I'm doing because it's a lot more visible on this green strip of lining. But I want you to use your green thread that you used for padding the canvas if you've worked off the Improvers bundle, or the same color thread as your lining or fabric. The first thing we're going to do is to mark about 1/8, that's 3 millimeters, above the point of our dart. That is going to be our starting point. We're going to take our lining. If you want to keep things consistent, make sure that you always have either the right or wrong side up. It doesn't really matter because this is going to be hidden by your fabric. So put your lining underneath the edge of your cut. You can have the side of the canvas laying flat as your starting point. Have a little bit more going above the top point of your dart, and align the edge of the cut with the center of your strip. Position it under your machine, put the foot down, needle down. On that point that we marked, we're going to curve gently into 5 millimeters away from the edge. So the edge of our foot is going to be aligned with the edge of our cut. Use a stitch length of about 2 to 3, but nothing too big. Now the edge of my foot is aligned with the edge of my cut, and I'm going to machine all the way to the bottom. If any of your padding threads are going the other way around, try to push them towards the center and catch them in your machining. And stop right at the edge. Cut your thread short, and that's our first line. You can also cut the thread at the top on both sides. And now it's time to close our first dart. Now, the easiest way to close a dart accurately is to mimic the shape that the dart is going to create. So if I put a block behind my canvas, that block is going to mimic the shape of the chest and is going to allow me to simply close my dart without the dart moving or shifting up and down. This is extremely important. When you close your darts, nothing should shift up and down. It should close as naturally as possible, like that, and there should not be a gap at the bottom of your canvas. So these two edges should meet. They should not be like this. All right, this is very important. So if you have a brush or some sort of a wide block, put it behind your canvas. Don't allow the canvas to go underneath the block. If it gets stuck, just lift it off and allow it to roll over and upwards. Now I'm going to start at our starting point. That's the dot that we marked. Needle down, make sure the block is positioned correctly, and then close your darts as naturally as possible, making sure that the bottom edge of your cut is meeting the other bottom edge of the cut. Hold everything down and make sure that your edges are pushed firmly against one another. It's okay if they slightly overlap. Again, sew and curve gently into a foot's width away from the edge of our cut. Now, when you get close to the bottom, mark 1 centimeter or 3/8 right underneath your cut and fade gradually into that point once you get to the end of your cut, your horizontal cut. Once you get to that point, remove the block, flip the canvas over, and again fade gradually into your previous stitching. A few stitches over, and that's it. You can cut your thread on both sides. So once you're done, your work should look something like this. Okay? On the other side, if you try to pull apart these edges, you should not see a gap. It should be firmly put together. That's very important. And neither should you have a gap here. So once you've done that, let's do the same on the other dart. Now, if you're wondering, why did this dart get bigger? Did we not cut it to be a bit smaller? That's true. That's because we closed the other dart and that has opened this dart up a little more. Again, lining strip up, align the edge of your cut with the center of the strip, mark 1/8 above it. Make sure that all your threads are towards the center so that you catch them with your machining. And let's begin. And here on this edge, we don't have any padding stitches, so these layers may move around. Try to hold them down as good as you can so that they don't start to overlap one another. And that's it. No back tacks needed. Put the chest area in front of the block. It should be very smooth and easy to do. You should not see any of this happening. You should just very elegantly be able to just fold this over without anything shifting up or down. Needle down on the starting point. And that's it. Cut your thread. And our second dart is now closed. One of the things you have to be careful for is that you don't end up with a pleat in between. If I try to open this up, if I do this, you shouldn't have a pleat in between your cuts, because that pleat will open up and then what's going to happen is your cut is going to have a massive gap. Okay? it's time to trim the lining. Flip the canvas over and cut everything to about 3 millimeters away from your machine stitch. And once you've done that, it should look something like this. Now it's time to do the zigzag on top of it. Start with your front dart right above your starting point. If you're working on a flatbed machine, loosen up the pressure of the foot so that you can pull your material freely without stretching it out. We have already done one zigzag on our shoulder piece. That's when we attach the shoulder to the body. It's going to be exactly the same. Needle in, pull gently to the side, steady pressure on the pedal, and then up, down with your back tack bar. And when you look at it from the back, it should be so that your stitches go one stitch at least over the edge of your lining. So this side is correct, this side is incorrect. The reason why it's incorrect is that you can still fold this back and it can create a pleat or a fold. That's not good. So try to completely flatten this by holding this down and going one stitch over the edge. Same for the other dart. And that's it. Now it's time to cover these zigzags with a beautiful folded edge strip. Take your canvas and one of your lining strips with the edges folded in. Next, make sure the chest is out of your way. Place the strip on top of your zigzag. The strip should be wide enough to cover your zigzag if you've done everything as neatly as you could. Now, what you should do is to make sure that you have a little bit above the top point of your dart and a little bit below it. Start from the middle without any back tacks. Position everything perfectly. If your padding stitches are facing the sides, just push them back underneath the strip to keep everything nice and tidy. Then start from the edge, put the foot down, needle down, and as closely to the edge as you can while matching the tape to your zigzag and the rest of your cut. Machine down and stop about ½ inch, that's 1.2 centimeters above the bottom point of your dart. Okay? Once you're there, lift up the foot and trim the edge, the bottom edge, about 1/4 below the base of your previous stitching. Fold the canvas over, cut the folded layer all the way to the edge, about 1 centimeter below your bottom edge. So from this edge, go 1 centimeter down, cut into the folded edge, and do the same on the other side. Then simply open up the folded edges, hold them flat like so, and then machine from the edge into a point in the middle at the bottom. When you get to the bottom, turn over, fade back into the edge, and go all the way up and do the same at the top. So 1/4, 6 millimeters above my last stitch, that's the top point of my dart, 1 centimeter down from the edge, cut into the folded line, open it up, so the inside looks like this. Do a few stitches over your starting point and you're done. And do exactly the same with the dart that we have on the side. Now with this dart, we will start not in the middle, but right on the outer edges. And that's that. This is how your dart should look like. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other canvas, and then it's time to attach our hip piece. We have covered the darts, we have done a zigzag, and we've finished off the insides. It is now time to machine the hip extension on. If you remember, our Pagoda model had an extended hip piece, and that is what we're going to machine. I've switched to black. You can stay with the same color thread that you have. I've just switched to black so that you can see what I'm doing, and this is how it goes. From this edge over, mark 1 centimeter. That's 3/8 of an inch. Do this as accurately as you can with short intervals. Once you've done that, take one of your hip pieces, and remember we had an angle at the top here, so that hip piece has to follow that angle downwards. Now here, a bit lower down, we had a notch that represented the hip line. So mark that notch so that you can see it a bit better, and find your notch on the hip piece as well. If you just open up the edge, you'll see a notch there. Now, what you have to do is to bring the notches together, overlap the layers, and match the edge of your hip piece to your pencil lines. You can, if you want, put a pin in there so that nothing moves. And then, with a slightly bigger stitch length, so for example a 3 or a 4, machine a foot's width, so align the edge of your foot with the edge of your hip piece, machine a foot's width inwards. So that's going to be right here, all the way down, while you match the edge of your hip piece against your pencil marks. No back tacks needed. And now it's time to do a zigzag over these two edges, so the top edge and the bottom edge. Now, it's very important for you not to create a dense zigzag. If this becomes very dense, this is going to be a very hard line that is going to collapse or break on your hip. We want this to feel the same as our canvas, so it should feel as natural as possible. Wider distances between your zigzags or a longer stitch length will help with that. Once you're done, it should look something like this, and you should have a small bubble right on this hip line. Now, depending on how your machine is set, these zigzags can look awful or they can look super neat and super tight. I must say that this machine does not really allow me to make a nice straight line. It jumps over and it keeps making these weird curved lines. But this, even though I'm not satisfied with it, will do because the distances are fairly consistent. The stitch length is decent, it's not too tight, it's fairly loose, and it allows the canvas to feel like one piece without making this area too rigid. If you see any distortions or any pulling or anything that is looking out of the ordinary and it doesn't look smooth, then you may have to redo it. On a domestic sewing machine, you may have an easier task at your hand because it will simply zigzag everything for you, and all you need to do is to feed it through. So let's do the other one. So now that we have machined and zigzagged our hip extension, let's take this on the board, evaluate it, and then finish it off. All right, finally, let's evaluate our work. Well, the first thing we have to do is to remove these extras that we have around the tips of our darts. Now, if you've already made a traditional model, you'll notice that there is a lot more shape in this canvas than that one. Well, of course, the reason for that is the dart that we have on the side, which is there for aesthetic reasons, not technical ones, because I don't have a chest. Now, what are we looking at and what should we be looking for? First of all, this is not the most technically optimized way to close darts. This is more an aesthetic approach, a fine approach, a more luxurious approach. This is there to satisfy your eyes and that of the customer if the customer cares for it. The best way to close darts is as we did on the traditional model, which is 2 layers of thin silesia, zigzag through both of them, which of course will make the zigzag on the inside also visible. But if you do that very neatly with matching colors, even that can be pleasing. Now, I assume that you've used matching thread on your lining, and so you're not going to have this crude effect that I have in front of me. But the idea here is that we create a very smooth surface on our canvas, despite the fact that we have made those massive cuts in it and all those materials have been moving and have been closing. So if you look at it from this side, you should see a nice consistent zigzag that covers the edges of your lining, prevents it from fraying. If you don't go over the edges, it will fold back and it can sometimes show an imprint. Another thing to look out for is, again, for the surface to be extremely smooth on the outside, which faces the fabric. The next important thing is, of course, the density of your zigzag. If your stitches get too close, so the zigzags are way too close to one another, you create a very rigid surface, which can cause breaks. You don't want them too wide because that's not going to be strong enough. So a distance of 1/4 of an inch, that's 6 millimeters, up to 1 centimeter, 3/8 is fine. Now I can understand that you may have struggled trying to close these darts together. If you're really struggling and whatever you do, you always have this breaking gap in the middle of your darts, what you should do when you're closing them is to overlap them by a millimeter or two. That, when zigzagged, is going to be compressed down and is going to prevent your dart from breaking in the middle. That is not a good effect. It will show on the jacket as well, especially around the side and of course the front. So that's more or less really the evaluation on the darts. The surface has to be good, not too rigid, strong enough, and above all, as neat as you can get it. Do your best to create truly a work of art when you're doing your canvases. It's already a lot of work, why not make it beautiful? Now, let's pin the hip extension that we have added to our canvas, which has created this hip shape, and hold our canvas up and have a look at it and see how it hangs. When we hold the canvas from the neck point, it should hang down nice and smoothly. You should not see any bubbles, breaks, cracks or creases around your darts or the lower half of your canvas. Now, looking at the sides and pushing against it, we don't see that concave break anymore that we had earlier on. What we see now is that the canvas is already curving around the body thanks to this dart, and that the sides are hollow and rigid thanks to the Silesia, which push everything towards the center when trying to bend around the body. Now, you might be thinking, Reza, you don't have a chest. Why did we put that dart there? That's a good thought. We don't have a technical reason to put that dart there, but the reason why we put that dart there is because we're trying to create a stylized garment. So sometimes you're allowed to put things that aren't there. I have to say, this is not going to stay as severe as it is now. I mean, now it looks like a lady's jacket. But what we're going to do is we're going to smooth everything out before and after we canvas our forepart. Now, another thing that I want to highlight is the cut that we have here. I've pinned it closed, but if I remove that pin, look what happens. It simply opens up. Now, some tailors leave this area open. I believe this is wrong. Why? The reason why this is wrong is twofold. First of all, we're going to have an extended piece on our canvas in the hip area. That is going to make the canvas heavy. On top of that, we're going to have a pocket. That pocket is going to be attached to the canvas. All of that weight is going to bring this down and create a distortion on your front edge, which is really not desirable. So what are we going to do? Simple. We're going to bring these edges close to one another and zigzag them on the machine. If you take your fabric and you lay it flat on your board, you see that your fabric has a wave on the sides here. That's a byproduct of your dart. Why? Because our body is an hourglass form, which is a negative surface curve. To cover a negative surface curve, we need to have extra length in that area to completely cover it smoothly. So that is why we're going to close this, and when we lay this on the table and it's going to be flat, we'll see the same wave on the sides here as well. Let's go ahead and close the cut. When you lay your canvas on your machine underneath the foot, the weight of that hip piece is likely going to pull everything down and thereby bring the edges together without them overlapping. Now, what we have to do is to make sure that we are within a certain domain, so we don't zigzag too far up and down. If you want, you can simply draw a line 1/4 of an inch below your cut at the bottom and at the top and zigzag within that area. Now, normally I don't mark this because I judge it by eye, but in the beginning it's helpful to do so. So, what you have to do is exactly the same as we did with the darts. Just make sure that while you're doing the zigzag, an overlap does not happen. So, let's do this. And that's it. When you're done, it should look something like this. And now you have a wave there instead of an overlap, as you can see. Let's evaluate this on our board with our fabric. When you lay your canvas flat on your board and you make sure that nothing is pulling against it, and you straighten and flatten your front edge, you will notice this small wave that we have next to our dart. This is essentially extra length that is created because of the shortness that we have created right on the dart. We've taken this fabric away, so that's become shorter than the area around it. Now, I'm going to show you something that we haven't covered yet, but if you've made a traditional model, you already know what it is, which is, of course, a 4-part with the darts taken out. When we take a 4-part with the darts taken out and we straighten and flatten the front edge, we'll see that same length on the side of our dart. Now, of course, when we're about to canvas our 4-part, we would lay our canvas on our board, like so, and on top of that, we're going to put our 4-part. That length will simply sit below the length that we have on our fabric, so they feel like one, and we'll be supporting it from underneath. That's all. I wanted to show you this to make sure that you understand the concept that I explained earlier around the cuts that we just closed. Just a reminder, we haven't done this yet. We haven't basted any of these darts. So in case you're thinking, well, what did I miss? You didn't miss anything. This is just there to show you why we did this. So that is really the last step of our canvas construction. So I would say congratulations on making the canvas for your pagoda model. Let's roll this up and take it to the next stage. And that was canvas construction. Quite the lesson. I know it may have taken you a long time to get there, but we have finally made it. Congratulations. Please don't forget the 5-step process to making a canvas. First and most important part is to soak the canvas. Whatever material you're using, never skip this part. A shrinking canvas inside your jacket will be your biggest nightmare. So prevent that and go through that process. The next step, which is the second step, is to cut out the materials. After that, we'll be basting everything together, then we're padding it, and then we're taking the darts out. Now, depending on what style you're working on and what materials you have and what kind of fit you're trying to address, canvas construction is heavily influenced by all those factors. That makes canvas construction one of the most creative and beautiful parts of bespoke tailoring. If you're starting out and you're seeing all those complicated diagrams of all those old book canvas constructions and you're wondering, what's this one doing? What's that one doing? A canvas is simply a flat piece of material that with the manipulation of darts and wedges is shaped into something that the tailor had in mind. That's all. Now, in many cases, it's the body that they're trying to address, but you can make canvases for a goat, for a cow, for a chicken. Doesn't matter. If you're technically sound, you know how to do it. So this is what I want you to take away. We are going through the process of making a jacket and we're doing it as thoroughly as we can. But the jacket is just an excuse for me to show you the most fundamental principles of bespoke tailoring. Anything that can be handcrafted using fabric, I want you to know about and I want you to be able to improvise around. To do that, you have to understand the alphabet of tailoring. That is not the same as making a jacket, making a trouser, making a waistcoat. All of those garments have the same underlying principles. I want you to learn those principles. So see every lesson as a new word, as a new letter. Because once you go through all of them, you'll be able to make your own story with your own vision. That's all. My name is Reza. This was today's lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care.